So many years ago, a woman in France inherited an icon, one of the paintings on an old piece of wood, a dime a dozen you buy at the church gift shop. This particular icon shows the scene of the mocking of Christ. So this would be when Jesus was taunted by the Roman soldiers before he goes to the cross. And you remember that in that story, they said, if you're king, then we'll give you a purple cloak and we'll knight you with our sword. He said, where's your crown? And they made for him a crown of thorns, and they put it on his head. Mrs. Goudier hung that icon in her kitchen over a hot plate. And I could imagine that having it there reminded her of Jesus' love, his courageous love for her, for our world that cost him his life. I can imagine that looking at that icon gave her strength to see Jesus' love for her every day, to know that she indeed was loved. There's love in the universe. Maybe it helped her love others. When she turned 90 and it came time for her to sell her house, she wanted to auction off her possessions, and she had an appraiser come in just to look at things. And the total contents of her house was about $7,000. That was it. Except for that icon over the hot plate. Because it turned out not to be one of the dime a dozen icons that one gets from a church gift shop. It was old. In fact, it was 800 years old. And it was an icon by Cimabue, one of the most important early Renaissance painters in Italy. A student of Giotto, Scrivani Chapel, one of the most incredibly beautiful chapels. And if you've ever been to Assisi, to the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi, you would have seen some of Cimabue's work. And the frescoes on the wall, and that lapis lazuli blue that has been there for 1,200 years. And Mary and the angels and St. Francis there in his humble robe and his monk's haircut and the halo and holding in his arms a bird. That's who painted the icon in her kitchen. She did not know what she had. It was valued at more than $6 million. Now, in this letter to the Ephesians, was not written by the Apostle Paul, but one of his disciples, also named Paul. And we read part of this today where Paul says to the church, do you know, do you have any idea what you have? And he prays that we might have a spirit of wisdom and understanding so that we can know what we have inherited as children of God. And he says that God has given us power and strength and ability and force and energy. In Greek, it's dunamis. And we get our word dynamite from that word. It's the power that God used to raise Christ from the dead. So what this letter is telling us is, as people of faith, God has given us the power to raise the dead. We have the power of resurrection to say no to violence, the power to take away fear, the power to love, even the most unlovable, the power to forgive, even ourselves, the power to heal the sick and feed the hungry. Paul chides us. Do you know what you have? Do you know the hope? He says to us, our faith is more than a dime a dozen icon sold in a church gift shop. It's more than fantasy fiction or a Facebook post. It is the power to love our enemies. It's the power to wipe away tears. Power to love the hated as well as the hater. The power to birth new life, even in the midst of death. And then Paul goes on to pray, and this is where where I start to feel lightheaded, because we're going so high that the oxygen is getting thin up there. God has exalted Jesus to be more powerful than chief priests and Roman emperors and presidents and tyrants and judges and dictators and lawmakers and Supreme Court justices and gun manufacturers and anyone else in our lives who has ever hurt us. And that power is greater than the power of greed or the power of loneliness. Or depression or anxiety. God's love is stronger and greater. And interestingly enough for us today, so much of Paul's ministry was about healing ethnic and religious divisions. The divisions between the Greeks and the Jews. He talks about breaking down the dividing walls of hostility, people who cannot stand each other. This is Paul's life's work. There is no longer Greek or Jew or male or female, slave or free, for all are one in love. And God's love that we know in Jesus Christ. So Paul would remind us today that the power of God's love is more powerful than what we've been seeing in the news this past week. God's love is more powerful than racism or hate or violence. That exploded at the Tom's supermarket in Buffalo, or the violence that exploded at the Geneva Presbyterian Church in California and their Taiwanese congregation. The power of love that God has for us, that gives us, is more powerful than lies and misogyny that seeks to control women, and greater than the power of Putin to invade and wreak destruction in Ukraine. As well as all of those powers that never show up in the news, but we know. The power that we don't talk about, the doubt that makes us question our faith or our life's work. Now, it's so much easier to think that the icon hanging over the hot plate might not really be so valuable. It's often difficult for us to believe that there is that power of love in the universe, that God exists and exercises that power, and probably most of all, that we have that power. It's probably easier for us to read Facebook posts than to truly contemplate what God has given us. In the intro to Ephesians, one of those things that you read at the beginning of the chapter that the scholars at Oxford Publishing, or Oxford, the editors of the Bible, I always have to go back to so that I can remember, okay, it's Ephesians, and what is this whole thing about? And he says that when we open up Ephesians and we're hearing this disciple of Paul, what he's getting at is to spark our imaginations and I think that this is the beginning of faith. Sometimes we do ask children, what would you do if you had $1 million? So I looked up online and on YouTube, and the most common answer, the number one thing that a child would do with $1 million is, say it. It's not the pizza. Buy a dog. And the second, get a cat. Now, it's a really expensive dog or cat, but most children do not know what $1 million is. They don't know what they've got. And as they grow up, we try to stretch their imaginations. Maybe you could have not just one dog, but you could build an animal shelter. Or maybe you could start a veterinary hospital. Or maybe you could become a veterinarian. Or maybe you could have a school for veterinarians and heal all kinds of dogs and cats and other animals. So Paul asks us, what would you do if you knew the tremendous power that God has given you or us? Because the you is always plural. We have this together. What difference, what would the impact be on our lives? What can you imagine? What difficult person would you imagine being able to love? Can you imagine being able to help someone in illness or to face tragedy? What would be easier for you? Last week, I took a class with the Lombard Mennonite Peace Center on mediation skills for clergy. We're talking about transformative mediation, not just negotiating a settlement or getting people to sit at the table together. And it's not about agreeing, but it's about changing people's way of being together and seeing one another, hearing each other's stories, justice making, making restitution, apologies, responsibility for one's actions, and being changed in the process. And the first thing we did was work on interpersonal conflict skills. And so I thought about a conflict that I had had with another clergy colleague, and how hurt and angry I was. And I wanted everybody to know how I had been wronged. And I told everybody. And I wanted everybody to tell me how bad it was. But in the midst of this workshop, I began to imagine what transformation might look like. And my anger dissipated. I imagined what transformation might look like. And it's so much easier to live in freedom. And so much easier to love. So what would happen in our world if we truly knew the tremendous power that God has given us for the sake of ourselves and for our world? Paul wants to stretch our imaginations. Can we imagine sitting down and listening and hearing the stories of someone filled with hatred and fear and lies? And could we imagine shutting down those lies? Can we imagine what transformation looks like in our nation? This is spiritual power. And imagination is the beginning of the spiritual power. It's the beginning. Imagining the power we have to raise the dead. Then, I think we begin to know a little bit of what we've got. Amen.